The Indian government response tends to be highly defensive. And I think that's a mistake, at least from a public diplomacy standpoint. There's very little evidence of majoritarianism in India. Reservation systems tend to benefit the best among the worst. My own impression is that Mr. Modi seems to be risk averse.
Hello, everyone. Today, I'm honored to have Professor Salvatore Babones. He is an assistant professor at the University of Sydney and a quantitative comparative sociologist. He is currently researching a book on Indian democracy. So, Professor Salvatore Babones, thank you for your time and welcome.
Great to talk to you. I'm an associate professor. Usually people accidentally promote me instead of demoting me, but either way is fine. It's great to talk to you.
So, Professor Babones, I would like to start by asking you about the response of the Indian governments to the rankings by the various institutes that you have mentioned in your previous podcast appearances and talks over the past 2 years.
The Indian government response tends to be highly defensive. And I think that's a mistake, at least from a public diplomacy standpoint. They should be offensive, which is to say the Indian government, if it wants to clean up India's image abroad, should be showing the ways in which the rankings are false instead of simply telling people it's none of your business. Now, it's none of your business as an answer may appeal to the Indian electorate. It may be a politically good answer to tell Western institutions, how dare you try to rank us? We're the oldest democracy in the world. We're the largest, the greatest democracy in the world. It's not for you to tell us what to think. That may all be very satisfying on an emotional level, but the fact is it doesn't play well in Western public opinion. From a public diplomacy standpoint, it would be much better for the Indian government and for Indian institutions in general to instead explain where the rankings get things wrong, to educate people about Indian democracy, and to take a more conciliatory approach to interacting with their Western interlocutors.
So, Professor, I'm curious to know how India can build that counter narrative. Like, is it by investing in their own news channel or lobbying or think tanks?
No, I think this is something that really can and should be led by the Ministry of External Affairs. Notice when Dr. Jaishankar goes abroad to talk about India, he is almost always talking to a domestic political audience. So if you think about what he says abroad, it really pleases Indians to hear him standing up for India. And of course, he should stand up for India. He's Indian and he represents the Indian government. But he could also spend more time educating Westerners about India. And let me give you an example even of Narendra Modi not taking this opportunity. When Narendra Modi had a press conference with US President Joe Biden after his visit to the United States, the US administration insisted that they had to take questions from at least one US journalist. And what did the Wall Street Journal do? They were the chosen journalists. They put up a Pakistani American journalist who asked a question about Muslim human rights in India. Now, that's an embarrassment, right? The Wall Street Journal should be asking about India's stock markets or India's openness to investment or trade with India. For the Wall Street Journal, America's premier business newspaper, to waste its question on virtue signaling about the status of Muslims in India is just ridiculous. However, it was an opportunity for Mr. Modi. He knew this was coming. As soon as he knew the name of the journalist who would be asking him a question, he knew this was coming. Now, his answer was, we adhere to all human rights responsibilities and Muslims in India have the same civil rights as anybody. Perfectly correct answer. It's not wrong, but it doesn't do India any favors. Americans watching that press conference would have come away with the impression that a journalist challenged Mr. Modi on human rights for Muslims, and Mr. Modi avoided the question. That's the impression he would have given. Now, if instead, he knew the question was coming, if instead Mr. Modi had prepared an answer along the lines of, thank you, young lady, for raising this issue. In fact, we know quite a lot about the status of Muslims in India. Here's item 1, here's item 2, here's item 3. The Pew Research Center survey shows Muslims report low levels of discrimination. In fact, Muslims are fighting to get into India, not to escape India. We have high levels of Muslim immigration. The Middle Eastern countries have been keen to work with me on our relationship. But if he had come in with a whole series of data about how Indian Muslims actually have full civil rights, how international organizations have found that India's Muslims have full civil rights, how Muslim majority countries have endorsed working with the Indian government, well, that would have been a very powerful answer on national TV in the United States in its highest profile venue possible. He chose not to do it. And I personally believe he chose not to do it because he is campaigning for a domestic Indian audience and their approval. He's not trying to win over the American population. Well, he has every right to do that. It's not his responsibility to win over the American population. But if he doesn't do it, nobody else will.
Yeah, Professor, that was a very enlightening answer on how the Indian government has to be better prepared to respond to such criticism from the Western media. I
I
want
would go
to,
further. I think the Indian government does not want to respond to those criticisms. That the Indian government, at least the current Indian government, has made the electoral calculation that standing up for India is a better vote getter than explaining India to the world. And so I can't believe that it is either stupidity or an oversight or a lack of strategy that results in this approach. It seems like it is the government approach. Whenever questioned, we stand up for India. And I know that plays well in Indian media circles and it plays well to the Indian public. It simply does not advance India's cause of improving Western understanding of India, outside the country.
yes, Professor, I completely agree with that point. Now, I want to move on to India's democracy. I want to avoid the questions that have already been asked to you about the rankings. Instead, I want to talk about some facets of Indian democracy. So, recently, I attended a talk in which the professor who was giving the talk uh, quoted the writings of Veer Savarkar and Deen Dayal Upadhyay and mentioned that Hindu nationalism stands for electoral democracy, but against liberal democracy, and this results in the minorities being relegated to second-class citizens. So, what do you use your take on this assessment?
This accusation of majoritarianism, the idea that there are two kinds of democracy, is something that political scientists and liberal commentators like to promote that has no empirical basis in reality. Now, liberal commentators, ever since John Adams, the American president, but before he was president, he wrote a book on the constitutions of the United States in which he talked about this fear that democracy would bring about majoritarianism. And it was important to have mechanisms to prevent majoritarianism in any future American republic. That idea has always been a stillborn idea. That is to say, we've never seen a well-functioning democracy. We've never seen any real democracy at all that has become a majoritarian democracy, where the majority has simply voted itself rights and taken them away from a minority. Maybe we could argue that has happened in Malaysia, which is all right. It is a democracy. It does have elections, and we might see some of that there. But certainly in India, with an 80% Hindu majority, there's no evidence that the Hindu majority has voted itself rights, privileges, reservations for jobs, tax breaks, uh, preferential religious treatment. In fact, India has voted exactly the opposite. And now, of course, we have heard the Congress Party repeatedly criticized and ridiculed for the one-time statement made by Rajiv Gandhi that the Muslims should have first call on our resources. But whether or not that's ridiculed or mobilized for electoral purposes, the reality is that India treats Muslim religious organizations with much greater respect and gives them much greater authority than it gives to Hindu religious organizations in the country. There's no evidence of money going specifically to Hindus, that Muslims have been denied access to government benefits or that jobs are reserved only for Hindus. Now, we could make some quibbles around the edges, public support for the Ayodhya temple project, but these are very minor concerns when seen in the context of an all of government budget. Right. So there's very little evidence of majoritarianism in India, or that that Hindus in India have leveraged their numbers to win elections and use those numbers to oppress Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and others in India. Now, there's some very modest evidence that the BJP in particular campaigns on pan-Hindu issues. That's true. When I once confronted a BJP spokesman over the fact that the party's own flag is a saffron flag, he pointed, no, our symbol also has green in it. It's like, well, yes, but, right? I mean, so to deny that the BJP is a Hindu origin party would be ridiculous. That said, other democracies have Christian origin parties. The Christian Democrats in Germany come to mind. The Christian Democrats used to be the dominant party in Italy. The idea of Christian democracy is a long-standing in European circles. But just as European Christian Democrats never put through policies to disenfranchise Jews or disenfranchise Muslims, or even to disenfranchise in Italy, to disenfranchise Protestants, even though just like that never happened in Europe, a Hindu origin party like the BJP has not, and probably could not, even if it wanted to, act in a purely majoritarian way in India. So this distinction between electoral democracy and liberal democracy, I don't think holds any water. All real democracies are liberal democracies. Even India, when people may say, well, we believe in democracy, but not liberal democracy, that's false. Indians of all political stripes believe in liberal democracy. The BJP itself takes the basic liberal principles of individual freedoms, individual choice, having strong institutions like independent Supreme Court and independent central bank. All of these basic precepts of free press, all of these basic precepts of liberal democracy are present in India, and no one is seriously trying to eliminate them. So I think this whole debate about electoral democracy versus liberal democracy is simply something that liberals try to use to manufacture controversy where none really exists. I've seen no evidence that the BJP wants to eliminate the Supreme Court, wants to eliminate freedom of the press, or wants to take away individual freedoms in India.
True, Professor. Prime Minister Modi has also, in the recent elections, did a significant outreach to the Muslim community. But what the BJP, in my opinion, could have done better is increase the Muslim representation in terms of the number of tickets given.
Yes, absolutely. So the primary sin of the BJP, I mean, there are minor low-level issues of vilification of Muslims, of use of inappropriate language. That all happens. And let's not pretend it doesn't. It's there, but it's there at a low level. The big failure of the BJP is not a failure of commission. It's not a failure of things it does that are anti-Muslim. It's a failure of omission, of the fact that it has been in government for 10 years. It's going to be in government for 15 years in all likelihood. And it's showing little signs of doing much of anything to improve the social inclusion of Muslims in India's national institutions and in India's political system. Now, often people in the BJP say, well, it's not our job, it's not our responsibility. And where the BJP a scrappy minor party trying its best to get a foothold in the Lok Sabha, we might accept that. But the BJP is the new political establishment in India. It's the largest party. It's the party that gets the most votes in India. It's it is the dominant party in the Indian political system, and that gives it a responsibility. Not only that, it's short-sighted of the BJP not to attempt to cultivate what we call in America, we use a baseball analogy, a farm team. Now, a farm team means, you have your main team, but you always need to have a secondary team, a tertiary team that feed talent up. So if you take the example of the Republican Party in the United States, the Republican Party in the last 50 years has never received more than 10% of the African American vote. In fact, only Donald Trump has received 8% of them. I mean, before Donald Trump, I believe the Democratic Party rarely, if ever, has received more than 5% of the African American vote. But the Republican Party has worked very hard over a number of decades to start bringing Black candidates up as mayors, as city councilors, as state representatives, to the point where they now have a very talented group, mostly in the House of Representatives, a couple, I think one senator, several in the House of Representatives, who are, talented, outspoken, serious presidential material. Some of them were talked about as possible vice president candidates for Donald Trump, who are African American. And that is resulting in the fact that over time, Republicans, and particularly the Trumping of the Republican Party, is breaking down that democratic dominance of the African American vote. Most experts expect that in the 2024 election, more African Americans will vote Republican than have ever done so before in history. The Republican Party, in effect, has broken the Democratic Party stranglehold. Now, Blacks voting Democratic is a stronger relationship in India than Muslims voting Congress, right? It's far stronger. Essentially, until recently, all African Americans who voted Democratic. That's changing. And it's changing because of 2 or 3 decades of hard work in outreach. Now, that's not only good for the party, it improves its electoral position and opens new electoral territory. It's good for the country. It's good for the country, and it's good for the overall unity of the American nation that African Americans are included in the American political mainstream. The BJP has a similar opportunity, and I would argue a similar responsibility to do that in India. That is to say, to seriously work on obtaining Muslim votes. And that can't be done in just one election. I know Narendra Modi made Pashmanda Muslim outreach a piece of his 2024 campaign. That's great. But the attitude seems to have been, from the analysts I've read, that, well, we tried that and it didn't work. Well, no. You don't do it one time. What the BJP has to do, if it's serious about this kind of outreach, is recruit Muslim candidates, recruit dozens of them at the local state legislature, state assembly, legislative assembly levels, recruit a few at the Lok Sabha level, give some safe seats to Muslims, not because it's a favor to Muslims, but because it's good for the BJP in that it will ultimately convince Muslims that the BJP is serious about reaching out to them and representing them. But it will also be good for the country if it does that. It will reduce the intercommunal tensions in India. So I view it as a huge missed opportunity. It's something that the BJP should be working on over not just one election cycle, but over the next 4 or 5 election cycles. And if they do, they will both succeed electorally and they will reduce tensions in the country at large.
Brilliantly put, Professor. Professor, I want to ask about your opinion on the assessment that Modi's party would have affected unprecedented constitutional changes if they had won a supermajority.
Well, first, I'd like to challenge the premise of the question. in a democracy, we should see changes that are responsive to changes to the outcomes of elections. So if the BJP had won a supermajority of 2/3 or more in the 2024 elections, we should see that as an electoral mandate for it to make major changes. Now, let's look at the changes they were talking about. I mean, if we're talking on the one hand about the changes of the Supreme Court and the structure of the Supreme Court and judicial appointments, well, the changes that the BJP wanted to put in place would simply align India with other developed democracies. That is to say, India has a collegium system for appointing judges. That's the only other countries that has a similar system is Israel. India and Israel also share the fact that the judiciary claims the authority to define what the Constitution is. That is, they have their own version in Israel of the basic structure doctrine. Well, those two aspects are unique to India and Israel. Now, in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu has proposed changes that go far beyond anything suggested by the BJP. That is, the Netanyahu's proposed changes to the law, the judicial laws in Israel, would have entirely politicized the judiciary, placing it under political authority. By contrast, the BJP's proposed changes for India would simply have aligned India with developed democracies like Australia and the United States. I mean, in Australia, the governing party plays a dominant role in appointing judges to the High Court. In the United States, as most listeners will be aware, the president appoints the justices of the Supreme Court. These aren't made by some nonpartisan panel. They're made by, even in Australia, by the party of the day. That is, getting an electoral mandate means you have the ability to define the legal terms in which the country operates. Now, nothing in what the BJP had proposed suggested to me that they wanted to entirely rewrite the Constitution of India. Instead, there were reforms like the judicial reforms or the Uniform Civil Code. Again, Australia has a Uniform Civil Code for all citizens. The United States has a Uniform Civil Code. Every developed democracy has a Uniform Civil Code. What would be so wrong or out of kilter for India to have that as well? It's a reasonable policy position that if the BJP had received an electoral mandate to put it in place, well, of course, I would expect that they would do so. Now, you had mentioned reservations for Dalits in India. A reservation system of any kind, whether it's for Dalits in India or African Americans in the United States, reservation systems tend to benefit the best among the worst. That is to say, they would tend to benefit the most successful Dalits in India, not the least successful. In America, we have lots of evidence that the African Americans who benefit from affirmative action policies are overwhelmingly the richest, generally speaking, recent immigrant African Americans. If you look even at Barack Obama, who went to Harvard University, well, his father wasn't a descendant of slavery. His father was a Kenyan PhD economist. And yet Barack Obama benefited and took that place at Harvard on the African American line at Harvard. Now I know India doesn't have the situation of immigrant Dalits, but nonetheless, there are successful Dalits. The successful Dalits in India are those who are most likely to get the reservation. Now, if instead India were to move to a system that was based on family income or family background, well, Dalits would still disproportionately benefit. After all, most of the poorest people in India are from the most depressed castes in India. But the most depressed among the depressed would benefit from the reservation instead of the most advantaged among the depressed. And that would actually be a positive policy outcome. So again, I'm not advocating that India should or must change its policy about reservations. I'm saying that a policy change arguably would be appropriate and certainly would be within the bounds of a democratic mandate had, as you suggested, the BJP won, a coalition 400 seats in Lok Sabha. Now, it didn't, and because it didn't, we won't see these kinds of bold policy reforms. But that's not to say that bold policy reforms are in any way inappropriate.
True, Professor. We have heard of the recent cases where some bureaucrats had faked their certificates to claim the benefits of uh, reservation. So my next question would be, do you think the BJP will muster the political will to enact labor and land reforms? And how do you see Mr. Modi navigating this coalition government? Because even his strongest supporters argue that it will be tricky over the next 5 years.
Well, I should make clear that I'm no expert on Indian politics as such. I've studied Indian democracy. So anything I say here, take with a grain of salt. These are just my own general observations. My own impression is that Mr. Modi seems to be risk averse. He does not seem to want to push through major economic reforms. He's not done so in the past, despite having a massive majority, being able to push through whatever reforms he wanted. Even the very modest farm laws that really didn't change the structure of Indian farming very much. They simply opened up some additional avenues for farm sales. In the face of serious protests, he withdrew those three laws. So I can't imagine that with a reduced majority, at that a coalition majority, not even a party majority, that Narendra Modi would want to rock the boat by pushing through major economic reforms. His last big economic reform, we have to go all the way back to demonetization. And demonetization was heavily criticized. Now, I'm not a monetary economist. I can't tell you whether it was, strictly speaking, a success or not. There was an immediate depression of GDP, followed by, some would argue, a later faster growth. I can't give you the answer to that. What I can say is that was his last really big economic reform. And the idea that he would undertake major economic reforms in the coming 5 years seems unlikely. But like I said, take that with a grain of salt. I have no particular insights into the psychology of Narendra Modi.
So, Professor, I just have one last question before we can move to the US election. So, you have personally met Prime Minister Modi. So, could you describe how the meeting was with PM Modi?
I had a scheduled 10-minute meeting at Mr. Modi's request that he extended to 15 minutes. I was really thrilled to have the extra time. We talked about data. We opened by him thanking me for everything I've been doing on educating Westerners about India. I brought with me to the meeting a copy of the Australian Financial Review, in which that very day I had an op-ed saying that we need data, not drama, in our India relationship. And in our entire meeting, that's the only thing he said in English. He looked at it and he said, data, not drama. That's good. I said, thank you, Mr. Modi. Everything else, he spoke Hindi to me through a translator. I then spoke English back. He clearly fully understood my English that I was speaking, but he chose to speak in Hindi. Most international leaders, as I understand it, when speaking officially, speak in their national languages. And so, that seemed reasonable enough. But he was friendly. We talked about data. He was very interested in data issues. I had told him what I saw as a lost opportunity for the Indian government to frame the narrative on India by providing more data with easier access. He seemed to understand my point, though I don't see that he's done anything in response to it. It's incredible to me that Indian firms run most of the world's websites, and yet if you go to a Government of India website, you'll find it's slow, it's clunky, it operates on 1990s menu-driven approaches to the internet. They're just not modern. And I think India could go a long way by first providing more and more detailed data about India freely on the web, and second, just by making it more accessible, so that instead of downloading a 800-page government document and having to find the information in it, that you could easily just use the web interface that's indexed by Google and quickly get information about India.
Well, Professor, that's a lot of insights Indian insights to unpack from you.